So Nehemiah. Last week we started our series on Nehemiah, and we saw the three different hats that he wears. At the beginning of the story, we were talking, he was wearing his cupbearer's hat. That's a professional hat that he wore. He was in a very wonderful job and, a very secure position in the center of government and in fact, the center of the palace. And he was wearing the cupbearer's hat. Nehemiah was one of the Jews who'd been taken away, and he actually is a second generation person. He's growing up in Babylon. He has never been to Israel, never been to Canaan, never been to Jerusalem, never even seen it. He's just heard the stories. And around our church, there are many children growing up, and their only experience is Aberdeen. And sometimes I was talking to Pastor Thomas once. I said, how did Kezia and Thomas get on when they went back to India? And he goes, they couldn't cope with the heat. It was just overwhelming, because they have become Scottish, They've become acclimatized to this weather, and they struggle to fit in back home. So that's what Nehemiah's like, okay? Nehemiah he knows all about his homeland through stories, but he's never actually been there himself. So we found him, he was wearing three hats. He was wearing the cupbearer's hat. And then the passion that rose within him when he began to talk to somebody who had returned and said, tell me what it's like. And they said, Jerusalem's in a really bad way. And something dropped in his heart. Something landed with him. And he changed his hat and became like a designer, a dreamer's hat, an architect's hat. He began to imagine what life would be like if they could repair the walls. And then when we finished off last week, he decided that he was going to be part of the group going back, and he put on his Bob the Builder's hat. And he decided he had got his hard hat on. He was going to go help repair the walls. So that's the three different hats that he wore. So I'll just pick up the story from there. I was thinking this last week, if some of our fathers of this land, if some of our forefathers, some of the Covenanters, some of the people who really were influential in the Christian world were to come back to Scotland, what would they think? I began to think, what would David Livingstone think? He was a scientist, he was an explorer, he was a missionary. What would David Livingstone think of the science curriculum that is being taught in our schools? And all about evolution and the Big Bang Theory? What would he think? It would break his heart. What would Mary Slessor, the wonderful Scottish missionary who went to Nigeria and really made such a difference? They would actually take twin babies and they would actually kill the babies because they believed that the babies were evil children. And they would also sometimes kill the mother as well. And she stood against twin births, and she said, no, twin births are not a freak of nature. They are not an evil thing. What would she think of abortion on demand in Scotland? What would Eric Liddell think, the runner we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, who took his stand about no compromising and standing on the word of God? What would he think about the compromising of the Church of Scotland, the church that supported him as a missionary? What would he think of the Church of Scotland now and how they have fallen so far back? I think those three would be like Nehemiah. They would weep and cry over this nation. And we are them. We are the 2023 girls that are standing and living in Scotland. We need to get a heart for our land. We need to look around and say, this is not how it used to be. This is not how it should be. And we should allow God to work in our hearts and work in it. When did you last think about Scotland and think about what's happening? And then I haven't even mentioned the whole identity crisis that is going on in Scotland. What would they think? What should we think? What should be our posture? Our posture, Nehemiah's posture, was to fall to his knees and pray and fast and seek God, and pray and fast and seek God, repeat. And that's what we should be doing, committing those things to the Lord. Do you get discouraged? Last week we saw that timing was absolutely everything. When it's God's time to move, supernaturally doors will open, and you will be able to walk through doors that no man can shut, and unusual doors will open. When it was the right time, Nehemiah did not approach the king. The king spoke to him and said, Nehemiah, you are so sad. You are so downcast. What's wrong with you? And because the king opened up, he just sent up, remember I said he sent up a quick prayer. Okay, God, help me. Here goes. I'm jumping in full feet. Sometimes you might have conversations at work. You've been praying for colleagues. They ask you a question. Something happens and you're like, okay. Right, Lord, here goes. Give me wisdom, Lord. Just throw up a quick prayer. Lord, Holy Spirit, speak to me. Let me say the right words. Let me bring them on their journey, not push them back on their journey, okay? So we should always be doing that. So when he spoke to the king, it was the perfect timing, because timing is everything. The king gave him permits to travel, which were incredible. He gave him supplies for the journey. He gave him protection for the journey, and he released him from his job. I mean, that is all those doors had to open. And so now we see Nehemiah has said, right, I'm going. So this is where we start this is where we started today. So the first thing, last week we had 3 hats. This week we're going to have 3 bits of equipment, okay? So the first thing is, get your binoculars out. We're going to spy out the land. So I'm going to read this passage. So Jeremiah says, so I arrived in Jerusalem. 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding on. After dark, I went out to inspect the broken walls and the burned down gates. The city officials did not know that I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not spoken to the Jewish people either. But now I said to them, after they inspected the walls, you know very well what trouble we're in. Jerusalem, you can see it's lying in ruins. Its gates have been destroyed by fire. Come on. Let's rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. Then I told them about the gracious hand of God. So he challenged them about the situation they saw, and then he told them about the hand of God that had been on me and about my conversation with the king. They then replied, let's rebuild the walls, and they began the good work. I think if I had arrived in Jerusalem with all that favor, with all those open doors, wrongly, I would have thought, I'm going to go and seek out the president here. I'm going to seek out who's in charge of this place. Hi, I'm here. I just want to let you know that I've got these letters, I've got this, I've got that. No, he didn't disclose anything yet. He still didn't feel it was God's time. It says 3 days after I arrived in Jerusalem. What did he do for those 3 days? I believe he walked, he had prayer walks, just like we have had prayer walks. He was walking, he was listening, he was talking, he was watching, he was using all of his senses. He was not speaking, he was listening and watching. So a few things to note. I believe he was walking, he was listening, he was guarded, and he was vigilant. Oh, thank you so much. I meant to take that. He kept his focus on God. So this is what happens. These are some pointers I got from those little things about getting out his binoculars and spying out the land. He was discreet. There was no fanfare. There was no, let me go and tell the powers that be that I am here. He just quietly went in. He preceded it with prayer, walking around the place. He prayer walked. He gathered like-minded people, the Jews, that were discouraged and disheartened. He gathered them. And they went for a walk. They went out at nighttime when nobody was about. They didn't all get animals. They took one donkey with them. And they quietly went out. People looking at them would have thought, you know, there's some people going for an isolated walk along the walls of Jerusalem. It didn't draw any attention from the powers that be, because he didn't feel in his heart it was the right time to say anything. For 3 days, I believe he was discreet, he was vigilant, and he was listening to the stories, never saying, hey guys, guess what my job is? Guess what God has told me to do? He waited and waited. Nobody knew of his intentions. And after that, Nehemiah, he talked about the disgrace, and then he said, by the way, let me tell you about God's hand, God's provision. The first thing he did was, when he got the men together, he gave glory to God. This is God's provision for me. And then let me tell you how the doors have been opened for me, okay? So it's interesting. Discretion, and then when you talk to people and share your heart, give glory to God for what he has done. This is what God has done for me, and let me show you my journey. So I just started writing down, because I always like to be practical. I just started writing down. In the year 2000, when Ian turned 40, you've maybe heard this story before, but when he turned 40, he was now becoming the senior partner of a very busy general practice in the city. And his senior partner was 60, and Ian was 40. He was retiring. Ian was organizing the big retirement thing. He stood up and gave a flowery speech and gave a few history, and as he sat down, God dropped something into his heart and said, do you think this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life? Because Ian hadn't thought anything else. He didn't know where that voice came from. He didn't know where that thought came from. It certainly wasn't on his mind. But he allowed God, with a soft heart, if you keep your heart soft, you allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you anytime, in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a room, in the middle of the night. And the Lord dropped into his heart, is this what your life is going to be for the next 20 years? And something resonated within him. He spoke to me. We did nothing. We spoke. I said, well, we'll see what happens. And then I had a different plan. I said, Ian, remember our plan? In 10 years, we'll have paid the mortgage off. We're going to then rent out our house. Our kids will be at university. We're going to rent out our house. And then we're going to go to the mission field. You'll be the doctor. I'll be the teacher. We won't need to go and get money from anywhere because the rent of this house will cover it. Remember our plan? He goes, yeah, I remembered your plan, but he couldn't put away, that was my plan. He couldn't put away what was in his heart. Okay? It was 4 years before he took on this church. He pondered and pondered. In 2001, he helped celebrate the church's 50th. At an AOG conference later on that year in 2001, he's walking along the beach in Prestatyn, and something has stirred in his heart again, and he's walking along and he picks up a stone and puts it in his pocket. He thought, it's like my destiny stone. And he carried that stone around, a little pink stone. He carried it in his pocket as a physical reminder that God has stirred his heart for this church, for ministry. He didn't know what it looked like, never been to Bible school, didn't know, but he didn't tell anyone. He didn't even tell me about the pink stone. I said, what's that pink stone? He goes, yeah, it's just something. Sometimes it's good not even to talk to your wife, because I would maybe discourage him, Yeah. Sometimes the conversations need to be intimate with you and God, okay? Yeah. And he waited. My dad was actively looking for a pastor for this church. And he came to Ian and said, he says, I've thought of this person. Ian said, oh, that's a great idea. I'm like, that's a definitely great idea. And we pursued it and everything. The guy said no. This person said no. That person said no. Dad's starting to stir. I'm almost 70. I need to retire. My mom says, you need to retire, John. You need to hand it over. And he's actively pursuing. We had different pastors that came and spoke, how you get visiting speakers. And 2 or 3 of them said to Ian on the side, I don't know what it is, but God is showing me that there's more to you, that actually you need to step up. And Ian's thinking, well, what does step up mean? Never said anything. And then we clearly knew, and he said to me, he says, I believe, Elizabeth, God is calling me to be the pastor of this church. And I said, Ian, if it's God, we are going to speak to nobody. We're going to say absolutely nothing. And God will have to drop it into my dad's heart. Because I knew my dad would have thought there was a bad idea. And I knew my dad was actively pursuing who was going to be coming here. So that was my fleece. Dad has to know. And so many months went by, and one day my dad phoned in and said, Ian, what are you doing this afternoon? It's your half day. Can we go for a walk? And Ian said, yes. So they go for a walk down to the beach, and my dad said, Ian, I don't know what happened to me last night. I had a dream. I woke up. I'm confused. I'm worried about who's taking over. And inside, this crazy thought, I don't know where it came from, but I'm just going to share my thought with you, and you can tell me yes or no, because I can't get this thought in my head. But when this thought came to me, I instantly had a peace in my heart, and I fell asleep. In fact, I slept in the next morning. My dad was always up at 6 in the morning. I slept into 7:30. He had a peace that landed within him. And Ian said, John, before you even speak, I'll tell you what you're going to share. And when Ian shared his story, my dad just couldn't believe it. And we knew the confirmation had happened, that this was what was going to happen. My mom had been praying with a prayer partner. Her prayer partner was Anne Stewart, which is, Anne Marie's mother-in-law. and they were praying for the new pastor and all this kind of stuff. And at this time, nobody knew anything. My mum now knew, but we still had a few months. And Anne said, you know, Betty, every time I pray, Ian's face comes up before me. I don't know why, but I can't think of anyone else who would be better suited to the job. And my mum said nothing. She was like, okay, let's just see what pans out. See, it took 4 years of slowly dropping. It's not that God forgot, but we didn't want to jump any guns. And God confirms through his word. God confirms through people speaking. God confirms sometimes through prophecy, sometimes reading your daily devotions, sometimes listening to a podcast. He confirms what he has, the plans he has for you. And so I just wanted to share that, and that's how we ended up here. And that was the first thing, spying out the land. For 4 years, we were looking at this church through very different lenses. Wow, what would that look like? What would we do differently? How would we do this? Oh my goodness, no. When problems arose, definitely, and this you really have thought the wrong thing, you know? But we knew inside that God would work things out. Second bit of equipment, okay, is when you are going around making plans, you need a clipboard and you need detailed drawings. You need the architect's drawings, because if you're going to be doing it, you need to have everything done. So this is what they did. So there's 2 things. The first thing Nehemiah did was build teams. This is overwhelming. I need teams. So he gathered the people. Listen, this is what we want to do. He shared the story with the leaders, and they said, okay. The first thing when you do things is don't do it on your own. Don't gather this is my ministry, I'm going to hold on to it. Then it becomes your thing. It doesn't become the church's thing, okay? So he gathered and built teams, and teams are so important. Teams are about everybody joining together and bringing all their different gifts and abilities to make things happen. In the end, when we become successful, if the church explodes and God's doing great things here, it is not because Ian took over ownership of this church. I want to say that. It's because God placed the vision in everyone's heart. Everyone jumped on the bandwagon. Everybody got involved. In the end, we make way for one another's gifts. Joy upon joy comes from doing it together. I'm going to say that again. In the end, we make way for one another's gifts. Joy upon joy comes from doing it together. Some people had natural gifts for building the walls, but there was many people that just were willing, okay? So there's natural gifts and there's willing gifts, okay? And, there's some people like, I'm really about organization. That's their natural gift. And other people like, you know what? Organizing, I can't even organize my wardrobe at home, but I will go and deliver things. I will go and clean up. I'll do this, I'll do that. We all bring something to the table. And I want to say to you, what do you bring to the table of the church that you serve in, okay? They all took responsibility. They all looked out for each other, because it's so-and-so was next to so-and-so was next to so-and-so was next to so-and-so. They were supporting each other. They were there helping each other and looking after each other. A story came to mind when my mom and dad were missionaries. They were in the mission field, and they were the ones that God had placed the calling of his heart to go to Afghanistan and Pakistan. But there was an army of people back in the northeast of Scotland who were prayer warriors. There was people who would send little parcels 2 or 3 times a year with little sweeties for us kids. There was people who would write encouraging letters. There was people who financially gave. There was my granny who would take an extra job so that she could send her tithe money. You see, they might have been on the mission field, but there was an army of people helping. And it wasn't just people from the congregation they left. I want to make clear of that. It was people from other congregations. And when we came back and we went, I remember in 1972, we came back to stay in Northern Ireland. We'd come back 4 years earlier to stay for, missionaries come back and stay for about a year. And we stayed in a little house in Northern Ireland with an outside toilet. This is in 1968. An outside toilet. It was very damp. The house was condemned and was about to be demolished, but the missionaries went and said, the people that went and said, could we get this house for just 1 year before you demolish it and put this missionary family? So Mom and Dad were thrilled. We stayed in this damp little house with an outside toilet for 1 year. It was great. Around the corner from where my granny stayed. When we came back 5 years later, all that whole scheme had been demolished. But the missionaries, but God stirred the hearts of people in a Baptist church, the local Baptist church, and they went to the council and said, if you could give us a flat, we would like to deck it out for a couple that are coming for a year. We will pay the rent for a year. This doesn't happen nowadays, but we came back from the mission field. I'll never forget the day. I was a little girl of 12. We went in and they opened the door and they had carpeted the house. They had furnished the house. They had filled the cupboards with food. They had done everything. They had furnished it all. They weren't even from the same congregation that had financially or supported or sent my parents out. They were from a local church. You see, God uses everyone, not just your gifts, but everyone. Kings, and I want you to know this, Kings is not the answer for Aberdeen. Every church is the answer for Aberdeen. Every church standing together saying, we've got this. Are you at your station? Yes. How can we help you? How can we serve you? How can we, at Sisterhood, come and join us. We'll study together. We'll lean in together. But you go and take that blessing back to your church. We're not here about building up the big church. We're here about building each other up. And I want you to know that. So the first thing is, when you're building teams is really important. The second thing is rubble. I don't know about you, but I love watching grand designs. And I like watching new builds and doing different things. But if you ever watch these renovation programs, they're also fascinating. They're very different from a grand design that's a brand new building. Because when you have an old building that you're trying to do up, the biggest problem is rubble. The biggest problem is rubble. When you have a new build, you have new plans, everything is new, you source materials, everything is spanking new, you cut the ground and it all looks lovely. But when you are redoing a house, or when you're remodeling a house, when you take on a derelict building and you're doing it, you have so much rubble. And that's what they were dealing with. They weren't just building a wall on a nice piece of green grass. They were building the wall with broken rubble and bricks that had been charred, and it was just a mess. So they couldn't even get started before they started moving the rubble, okay? And they all had a problem with this rubble. Rubble represents opposition. When you start building things, when you start building teams and God's put something in your heart, expect opposition. Expect it, because it will be coming. The rubble has to be moved. The opposition has to be moved. And I would just say that there, okay? And when you're doing a remodeling or you're renovating a house, three things have to be sorted. You have to haul away all the heavy stuff that you don't want. You have to sort through all the piles of stuff, good, bad, chuck. We've done that all the times in our houses, don't we? What can be passed on, what can go to charity, what needs to go in the bin when you look at your clothes. They have to do this with the rubble. They have to haul the stuff, heavy stuff away. They have to sort through endless piles, and they have to salvage what can be kept. So there's three jobs, and they're all doing this. The journey is messy, it's unpredictable, it's costly, it's unforeseen. And they think they've got all the stones, but we don't have enough stones. We have to go and get some stones. Where are we going to get the stones from? This is no use. This stone is crumbling. Let's get rid of it. So they have all these different things that they have to do. The rubble at the beginning, you know, when Nehemiah goes, he said, yes, let's get this done. We're going to start doing this. We're going to build the walls. But before they could even start, everybody was enthusiastic. And you know, the opposition came in the form of Sanballat and some of the other ones, Tobiah and some of them. They came and they mocked. What are you guys doing? Building that? What a joke. Laughing, mocking them. They're looking at their detailed plans, and behind them they've got mockery. They've got people laughing. They've got people criticizing. You guys are a waste of time. As soon as you build it down, we'll knock it down. One of them even said in the Bible, even a fox could knock that wall down. This is a criticism they were getting. This is a criticism they were getting. What a bunch of rubble. What are you doing? And so that's what happened. They were getting this opposition daily. They were listening to it. And Nehemiah was let me tell you, I'm going to strengthen you. So with this clipboard, they've gone round, they've decided, and they're now getting rid of the rubble. And that's one of the most important things about getting, and what I've written down here is mockery, and that will come. And it says in verse 16, from then on, Nehemiah said to them, ignore. Remember who God is. Remember what the plan is. He's got the detailed plans. Come on, guys. Remember what God said. Remember the miracle. Remember how he's opened doors. And he was encouraging them and strengthening them. And I would say, if you have rubble that constantly comes up in your life, you're moving on and something comes up and you're like, I need to get rid of the rubble in my life because this is what's holding me back. This is what's not allowing progress in my life. So look at the rubble and decide, do I need this? Do I want this? Is it necessary for my journey ahead? Is this necessary for my new season I find myself in? So the third thing here is when you get the completion certificate, okay? You've got your binoculars, you've spied out the land, you've got your detailed plans, you know what's going on, everything is great, and then you long for that completion certificate that you can wave it about and go, it's done. I remember getting inspectors coming to look at an extension. They came, they were like, this is to be changed, this is to be changed. Oh, for goodness sakes. And our builder had ignored one or two things, and we had to go back and get it fixed, and then we got the completion certificate. But until you get the completion certificate, there will be opposition. There will be problems, okay? In verse 16, because they weren't just getting the verbal abuse, and they began to now get physical abuse and spiritual attacks. Nehemiah said, from then on, I said to half of the men, only half of you work, and the other half stand guard with spears and shields and bows. Stand and protect the workers. So they were all going to be building this, but now he said, right, only half of you build it. The other half turn around and look for the opposition and stand guard. And then he said to them, do not be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers. Fight for your families, fight for your daughters, fight for your wives, and fight for your homes. So he was encouraging them, remember, God is more than able. You're not just building this wall for yourself, you're building it for your families, you're building it for the generations, you're building it for the people who are coming up, you're building it for those children playing over there, you're building it for the teenagers over there. And we say that all the time in Kings. We're building this not just for ourselves, we're building it for the generations to come. Okay? So opposition will come. It's so interesting. At the beginning, there's a very interesting verse here. And sometimes this can happen. And be aware of this. Because the people who were in opposition began to call it rubble. What are you doing using rubble? It's absolutely rubbish. Why are you building with rubble? And they were like, we are building the wall of God. We are doing it right. But you know what? There is a verse that's very interesting. And this was someone else's thought, so it's not my thought, but I thought it was really good. Halfway through Nehemiah 4, verse 10, halfway through the wall, the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired, and there is so much rubble to be moved. We are never going to be able to build this wall by ourselves. They took on the language of the opposition. How many times have you heard people criticizing the church, criticizing different things, and you're like, that's not true? And then suddenly you're like, actually, when you get discouraged, when you're low, you're like joining ranks with them. Yeah, you're right, there are a bunch of hypocrites in church. You began to almost use the language of the opposition. And they were using the language, they were saying, we're never going to manage to do this, Nehemiah. We can't do this anymore. How are we going to build this? And it's all just rubble anyways. And he said, no, it's not rubble. These are living stones. Remember who you're doing it for. Remember what you're doing it for. And so that's what happened. And of course, within 52 days, the wall was complete, which was absolutely supernatural. 40 sections of the walls had been repaired, and there was 12 gates that had been restored. I just want to mention about gates. Gates are where people enter a city and they exit a city. Gates are the most vulnerable place in the walls. of strong structures, and you need to be vigilant at the gates. And I just want to say, girls, there are gates in your world. There are gates in the walls of your heart. Be vigilant and keep your eye open. Who is going to enter those gates? Be vigilant. Don't let anyone walk through those gates of your heart. Be careful. It says in Proverbs 4, verse 23, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. And in the Message version, keep vigilant watch over your heart, because that's where life starts. And so that's what I would say to you. Be vigilant. Are we vigilant about the traffic coming in and out of our gates? Are we slack and allow things to enter and speak into our world that we shouldn't? Who are we listening to? Have we ever considered the mindless entertainment, and I'm speaking to myself now, the mindless entertainment of social media or the television that actually is a wide open gate for comparison, for, oh, they do it so much better, oh, my life isn't as great as anyone else's? All that mindless entertainment can be a gate in our life. Be vigilant over that. What voices do we allow to influence us? And are the gates in your life, this is a challenge for you, are the gates in your life, are they bringing peace or are they bringing turmoil? Are they bringing joy or are they bringing unrest? Are they bringing contentment or are they bringing dissatisfaction? Ask yourself those words, you know. When Ian had just not long started, and there was a pastor's conference. It was somewhere out in Cults. It was for all the different pastors of the city. So we had thought, oh, I'm going to a pastor's conference. So he went along and he was excited and he went there and he listened in to everything that was happening. There was a lot of theology. There was a lot of people sharing, and there was this very special speaker. And at the end, someone turned to Ian. A couple of the pastors turned to him and said, what are you doing here? And he goes, oh, and he didn't say anything. He goes, what are you doing here? I mean, your church isn't about theology. Surely you just have some swinging chandeliers. You're quite shallow in your church, aren't you? And Ian just didn't say much. This was coming from pastors. This was 20 years ago. And this is him going to a pastor's conference. And someone said that if he had been confident within himself, he might have brushed it off. But you know, when our gates are a little bit vulnerable, and those voices come, things we should brush off, we take on board. And he thought, what am I doing here? I'm far better as a doctor. What am I doing here? I haven't been to Bible school. I haven't been to theology. I don't know in fact, I don't know what all these big long terms they're mentioning. And as he's driving home, he's thinking, I'm just a phony. I'm just a con artist. I don't know if I've really heard from God. And this is the word that God dropped into his heart. Ian, remember the people of Goshen. 70 people went to live in Goshen. They were insignificant shepherds. They went to live in Goshen, in a part of the land that nobody really wanted to go to. And when Moses came, there was 2 million of them. They were strong. They were mighty. They held up the economy of the country. And that word dropped into Ian, and he has clung on to that word anytime he's felt discouraged, anytime he's had a health scare, anytime he's had something where someone has mocked or said something, or he's felt insecure, or he's felt inadequate. He remembers the word, remember Goshen. And every now and then we encourage ourselves with that word. God will always use you, and he will always give you the word for the right season. When your gates are a little bit vulnerable, when you've allowed someone to speak into it, how does it land in your heart? If it lands with offense, if it lands with judgment, if it lands with hurt, then go back to the Bible. What did the Lord say? God gave him the word, and Jeremiah is like, well, that's right, I remember. And the key verse that you should memorize in your head, Nehemiah 8 verse 10, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Always come back to that verse. The whole book can be hinged on that. Someone said, large doors are hung on small hinges, okay? The huge vision that God had given Nehemiah, the huge vision that God is going to do in this city, it hangs on small and on the faith of the small. And we're like, you know, God, I'm a little hinge in your world. I'm holding this up. I don't think I'm doing much, but you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing. And the fact that you are wanting to lean in and find out more about what God is going to do, that is amazing, because God does amazing things through you. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say, get your spiritual binoculars on, watch, listen, pray, repeat. Stop talking. I'm talking to myself here, okay? Watch, listen, and repeat. Get out the clipboard, see what God has for you, start journaling and writing things down, and commit everything to prayer. We are all valued and we are all important. Find your space in the local church and serve diligently. Remove the rubble from your past that's not going to help you build freely in your present and in your future. Watch for opposition. Guard those gates. Guard the gates of your heart. And remember, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And this will give you strength and weariness when your confidence, this will give you strength in your weariness, and it will give you confidence in your fears. So when you're fearful, when you're not feeling confident, quote that verse to yourself. And just like we said in that song, Gratitude, come on, my soul. Don't get shy, sing out and speak. Put some praise worship on. Stir up your heart. We don't need other people to stir our hearts up. You can stir it up because you've got the Holy Spirit living within you, okay? Great.